My name's Adrian, I'm 27, and this whole mess started on my birthday. I'll never forget the way my mom leaned across the table at the little Italian restaurant she had picked out, smiling like everything was normal, and said, "We didn't get you anything this year. Money's tight." The words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't the lack of a gift that stung. I've never been materialistic. It was the tone. The way she delivered it. Almost cheerful, like it was some casual joke. Everyone else at the table chuckled, and I forced a smile, though something in me sank. I brushed it off with a nod and told myself, "It's fine. You're an adult. Birthdays aren't supposed to matter anymore." But that little sting never left. I've always been the one in the family who sends money when things get rough. A couple of months earlier, Dad had called me out of the blue and mentioned how bills were piling up, how Mom's hours were cut at work, and how they were falling behind. I didn't even hesitate. I transferred a few thousand from my savings. I figured that's what you do for family. You step up. You sacrifice a little so everyone else can breathe easier. That's how I was raised. Or at least that's what they always told me growing up. Family comes first. It was practically our motto. And I believed it. So, sitting there at my birthday dinner, listening to them tell me they couldn't afford anything, I reminded myself of that same motto. Maybe things really were still tight. Maybe the money I sent just wasn't enough. I told myself it wasn't about me, that I shouldn't be selfish, that family struggles together. Still, I couldn't help but notice the way my younger brother, Kyle, was scrolling on his phone the whole night, smirking occasionally at something he wasn't sharing. He's 23, and let's just say responsibility has never been his strongest trait. But he's the baby of the family, the one who's always been shielded. When he crashed his car last year, my parents swooped in and bailed him out without a second thought. When he dropped out of college, they blamed the professors, the environment, anyone but him. Meanwhile, when I worked 2 jobs during my own college years, they told me it was building character. That night, I pushed the thoughts away, trying to enjoy the spaghetti carbonara in front of me. My parents laughed, Kyle barely looked up, and I tried to remind myself that family time mattered more than material things. After all, birthdays aren't about gifts. That's what I kept repeating in my head. But the universe has a funny way of pulling the rug out from under you just when you're trying to stand steady. The next morning, I got a call from an old friend of Kyle's. He was the type who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. "Hey man," he laughed into the phone. "Did you see the watch your brother got? Thing is insane." I blinked, confused. "What watch?" He laughed again, like I was joking. "The Rolex, dude. He showed everyone last night. Said your parents surprised him with it. Guess they finally stopped babying him with cheap stuff." My stomach twisted. I barely managed to mutter something back before hanging up. My hands were shaking as I opened social media, and sure enough, there was Kyle, posing with his new toy, the caption smug as ever, "When your parents know you deserve the best." My eyes went straight to the comments. People were fawning over it, congratulating him, asking how he managed to get one. And then, in the background of one of the photos, I noticed the box. The receipt still peeking out from inside. The same handwriting I'd seen on countless family notes, Mom's. That was when the sting from last night turned into something sharper. I wasn't angry at the watch itself. It wasn't jealousy. I've worked hard enough to buy myself nice things when I want them. No, it was the realization. The money I had sent, the money they told me was keeping the lights on, covering bills, easing their struggles, had gone straight into wrapping a Rolex around Kyle's wrist. My tight money birthday dinner made a lot more sense now. My silence at the table suddenly felt like a joke they were all in on. And that realization cut deep. I didn't say anything right away. That's just how I've always been. I sit with things, turn them over in my head until I can't anymore. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they split the money. Maybe it wasn't all of it. Maybe Dad got a bonus. Maybe Kyle chipped in. But the more I thought, the more I realized I was just trying to protect myself from the truth. I'd been played, manipulated by the very people who raised me. And that thought followed me around like a shadow for the next week. At work, I found myself zoning out in meetings, wondering how long this had been going on. At night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying moments from the past. The times I skipped vacations to send them money. The holidays where I went without so they could have more. The way Mom always said, "We're proud of you, Adrian. You're the responsible one." I used to wear that phrase like a badge of honor. Now it felt like a trap. Being responsible was just code for being the family's personal safety net. Every text from them, every phone call, started to sound different. What used to feel like normal family chatter now rang like veiled requests, hidden expectations. I started noticing patterns I had ignored before. Kyle bragging about things he earned, while I knew deep down where that money had come from. Mom dismissing my concerns whenever I questioned why certain expenses never added up. Dad staying silent whenever I asked direct questions, just shifting the conversation to how proud they were of me. And underneath it all was this gnawing question I couldn't shake. If they could lie to me about this, what else have they lied about? That thought was still in my head when I finally decided to drive over to their house one evening, unannounced. I told myself it was just to clear the air, to give them a chance to explain, maybe even to apologize. But deep down, I already knew the truth. When I pulled up to the driveway, I saw it instantly. Kyle leaning against the hood of his car, flashing that Rolex in the evening sun like it was part of his DNA. He spotted me and smirked. "Hey, big bro," he said, lifting his wrist in mock pride. "Like the new toy?" I stared at it for a moment, my mouth dry, my chest tight. And that's when Mom stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowing at me like she already knew why I was there. I hadn't even said a word yet, but somehow, I felt the entire storm building in that silence. And that's where everything began to unravel. I stood there in the driveway, watching Kyle admire the glint of his Rolex like it was the crown jewel of his existence. He didn't even look at me the way brothers should. There wasn't any warmth, just this smug pride, like he'd won some game I hadn't even realized we were playing. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to keep my voice calm. "Nice watch," I said evenly. My words carried weight, though, and everyone heard the undercurrent. Mom stepped in quickly, too quickly. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, her voice sharp with this forced brightness. "He deserves it. He's been under so much stress lately." "Stress?" "Kyle." I almost laughed. He worked part-time at a gym, spent most of his days posting half-baked motivational quotes on social media, and lived rent-free under their roof. Meanwhile, I was paying my own bills, juggling long hours, and still sending money home whenever they hinted at being strapped. I bit my tongue, but something in me cracked. Dad appeared next, shuffling out onto the porch with his usual tired sigh. He glanced between me and Mom, then to Kyle, before muttering, "Let's not start anything, all right? We should be proud of Kyle." That word again. Proud. They threw it around like confetti when it came to him. For me, proud always came with strings. Proud that I was reliable. Proud that I worked hard. Proud that I could handle myself without help. For Kyle, it meant indulgence. It meant justification. It meant excuses dressed up as love. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "The money I sent, was it for this?" The air shifted. Mom's eyes flickered for just a second, but then she tightened her jaw. "Don't be dramatic. We've sacrificed plenty for you over the years. Don't you think your brother deserves something nice for once?" The words slammed into me. For once. Kyle had been coddled since birth. I remembered when I was 16, saving up for months to buy myself a used laptop for school. Meanwhile, Kyle, at 13, had begged for the newest gaming console, and he got it, wrapped in shiny paper, no questions asked. That pattern hadn't changed. But now, they were using my hard-earned money to keep it going. Kyle finally chimed in, laughing as he tapped the watch face. "Lighten up, Adrian. You make good money. What's a couple grand to you? Besides, you wouldn't even buy something like this for yourself. You're too boring for it." That was the moment I realized he didn't just feel entitled. He felt entitled to me, to my sacrifices, to my silence, to my role as the brother who absorbed the blows so he could shine. I wanted to walk away, but Mom wasn't finished. She walked down the steps, her voice low but firm. "You always think you're the victim. You're not. You're just reliable. That's who you are. That's your role. Stop resenting it. Your role." Like I was a character in a script they had written years ago, and I was expected to keep playing it forever. Responsible Adrian. The fixer. The provider. The one who quietly accepts money's tight, while his brother flashes a Rolex bought with that same tight money. Something burned in my chest, but instead of exploding, I swallowed it. I've learned that rage gives them ammunition. It makes you look unreasonable, while they play the calm, rational victims. So I stepped back and simply nodded. "Got it," I said. My voice cracked just enough for them to think they'd won. But inside, something shifted. A line I didn't even know existed had been crossed. The following weeks only drove the knife deeper. Every phone call, every visit, carried these little cuts. One evening, Mom casually asked if I could help with the electric bill again. When I hesitated, she sighed and said, "Well, I guess Kyle can cover it if he sells his watch." She said it with this pointed glance, daring me to be the reason her golden boy lost his prize. I paid it, of course, not out of duty anymore, but because I wasn't ready to show my cards. Not yet. Another time, Dad mentioned how proud he was that Kyle was finally finding his way. This was after Kyle bragged about quitting his gym job because he needed space to think about bigger things. They clapped for him like he'd just gotten into law school. Meanwhile, when I mentioned a promotion I'd been working toward for months, the room went quiet. Mom eventually smiled and said, "That's nice, Adrian. But don't work yourself into an early grave." Then she turned back to Kyle to ask about his plans. And Kyle, he reveled in it. He started making little digs whenever I was around. "Must be nice, having me to give you purpose," he said once, grinning. Or, "Don't worry, bro. I'll keep living it up so you have something to aspire to." It was taunting, plain and simple. I noticed, too, how quickly Mom defended him whenever I so much as raised an eyebrow. "He's just joking," she'd say. "Don't be so sensitive." That phrase, "don't be so sensitive," became a shield they hid behind, a way to gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. But I wasn't overreacting. I was observing, learning, seeing patterns I had ignored before. The more they pushed, the quieter I became. The quieter I became, the bolder they got. And the bolder they got, the clearer it became what had to happen. The turning point came one Sunday afternoon when I stopped by for dinner. Kyle strutted in late, holding a new designer jacket, tags still hanging. Mom squealed like it was Christmas morning. "Oh, Kyle? That's gorgeous." Dad chuckled. "Sharp as ever, son." Then Kyle smirked at me, leaning close enough for only me to hear. "Paid with your money, too. Cheers, big bro." I froze. My fork clattered onto the plate. No one else seemed to notice. But in that moment, something inside me went still. Not broken, not defeated, just still. Because finally, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The weeks after that dinner felt like I was moving through fog. I'd go to work, meet deadlines, nod along in conversations, but underneath, my mind kept circling back to that smirk, to Kyle whispering in my ear about how he'd bought his new jacket with my money. The thought didn't just bother me, it haunted me. Every time I tried to convince myself it wasn't worth the energy, the memory replayed, sharper and uglier. I started pulling away from my family, not out of strategy, but out of survival. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages stayed read but ignored. I told myself I needed space. And for a little while, it worked. I could almost breathe again, like I was carving out a tiny piece of peace that belonged only to me. But toxic families don't let go that easily. It was a Saturday morning when the betrayal hit like a freight train. I had just woken up, still half asleep, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was my bank. "Mr. Rivers." The woman on the line began politely. "We're just confirming a large purchase that was flagged on your card. A luxury electronics order, totaling just over $6,000. My chest tightened. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples. "I didn't make that purchase." There was a pause on her end. "All right, thank you for confirming. We'll freeze the account immediately. Would you like us to file this as fraud?" "Wait, where was the order made?" She rattled off the shipping address, and my stomach dropped. It was my parents' house. I think I forgot how to breathe for a second. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "File it as fraud." When the call ended, I just sat there, staring at the wall. My parents had access to my information. Years ago, when I helped them refinance some bills, they'd insisted I share certain details. I'd never thought twice about it. Family trusts family, right? But now I had the cold, undeniable truth. They had used my identity, my money, without asking, without hesitation. I drove over there that afternoon, anger boiling but contained, like lava under rock. Mom was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a pot of sauce. Dad sat in his chair, watching the game. Kyle lounged on the couch, flicking his Rolex like it was a nervous tick. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Who used my card?" My voice was steady, but the silence that followed told me everything. Mom's spoon froze mid-stir. Dad shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by the TV. Kyle didn't even look up. Finally, Mom spoke. "It was just easier that way. We'll pay you back, Adrian." The words rang hollow. I laughed. Actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. Pay me back? With what? The money I keep sending you. Kyle finally looked up, smirking. Relax, big bro. It's not like you're hurting for cash. You should be grateful we trust you enough to lean on you. Grateful? That word twisted inside me. They wanted me to be grateful for being stolen from. Dad finally chimed in, his voice low. Don't blow this out of proportion. Family share. That's what we do. I stared at him, incredulous. Share? Sharing is when both people agree. This was theft. Mom snapped then, her voice sharp and defensive. Stop being so dramatic. We raised you. We sacrificed for you. And this is how you treat us? Acting like we're criminals in our own home. The room blurred for a moment. I wasn't just dealing with a watch anymore, or favoritism, or even manipulation. This was betrayal in its rawest form. They had taken from me, crossed every line, and instead of remorse, they twisted it back on me. Made me the villain for daring to call it out. And that's when Kyle stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. He walked right up to me, close enough for me to see the smugness radiating off him. He lifted his wrist, flashing the Rolex in my face. Face it, Adrian. You'll never stop us. You're the responsible one. That's your job. It's who you are. And deep down, you'll keep playing it. Because without us, you'd have nothing. It was the smirk that did it. The same smirk I'd seen on my birthday. The same smirk when he whispered about the jacket. That smirk became the symbol of every betrayal, every manipulation, every time I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of family. I left without another word. If I stayed, I wasn't sure what I'd do. That night, lying awake in the dark, I realized something terrifying and liberating all at once. They weren't going to stop. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. I wasn't a son or a brother to them anymore. I was an ATM with a pulse. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself why they would do this. I started asking myself how I was going to make it stop. That was the night I began to plan. After that night, I felt hollow. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a kind of numbness, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left an empty shell walking around. At work, I was a ghost. I'd sit through meetings staring at the notes in front of me without hearing a word. When coworkers asked if I was okay, I'd force a smile and say I was just tired. It was easier than trying to explain the kind of exhaustion that comes from your own family stabbing you in the back. At home, the silence was heavier. I'd come back to my apartment, drop my keys on the counter, and just sit there staring at nothing. I didn't even bother cooking half the time. I'd pick a takeout, scrolling through my phone without seeing the words. And every so often, I'd open Kyle's Instagram. He was posting nonstop. Pictures of the Rolex, the jacket, new shoes, dinners out. The captions were what stung the most. Hard work pays off. When you're winning, they hate to see it. Born to shine. And all the while, I knew exactly whose hard work was funding it. The financial fallout came fast. With my account frozen and fraud investigations underway, I spent weeks scrambling. I had to call my landlord, explain why the rent would be a couple of days late. I had to dip into emergency savings just to cover basic expenses until the bank sorted things out. And still, part of me hesitated to cut my parents off completely. Some small, stupid part of me kept thinking, they'll realize what they did. They'll apologize. They'll make it right. But that moment never came. Instead, Mom called one afternoon. Her tone was casual, almost cheerful. Adrian, the electric bill came in higher than usual this month. Can you cover it? I sat there gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. No, I said flatly. There was silence on the other end, and then her voice sharpened. No? Adrian, don't be selfish. You know Kyle's between jobs right now. We can't put that kind of stress on him. Something in me snapped. Mom, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep sending money just so you can hand it over to Kyle. I know what's been going on. Her voice rose. Don't you dare talk about your brother that way. He's trying, Adrian. He's always tried. You've had opportunities he hasn't, and you don't even see it. Everything you have, it's because we sacrificed for you. And now you want to turn your back on us. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. I realized then that no matter what they did, they'd always rewrite the story to make me the villain. In their eyes, I wasn't the son who helped. I was the selfish one who didn't do enough. That realization sank me into the lowest place I'd ever been. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped checking Kyle's posts, even though the urge burned in me. I started walking late at night, just to clear my head, wandering the quiet streets until my legs ached. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a piece of myself I'd lost along the way. One night, I ended up in front of a bookstore, the lights still glowing though it was nearly closing. On impulse, I went inside. My eyes drifted over the shelves until they landed on a book about boundaries, how to set them, how to hold them, how to stop letting people take from you until there's nothing left. I bought it and read half of it that night, hunched over in my bed with the lamp burning. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of control. Slowly, I started putting pieces together. I called the bank, tightened security on every account, changed every password. I pulled my credit report, scanning for anything I didn't recognize. And sure enough, there it was, 2 credit cards I hadn't opened, both linked to my parents' address. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, then filed disputes with shaking hands. The process was slow and humiliating. Every time I had to explain to some representative that my own parents had opened accounts in my name, I felt a little smaller. But with every call, every step, I was also building something inside me, something stronger, sharper. I started writing things down. Dates, amounts, conversations. I kept it all in a folder tucked away in my desk, labeled simply family. At first, I didn't know why I was keeping it. Maybe part of me just wanted the truth somewhere outside of my own head, where no one could gaslight me into doubting it. But the more I added, the more it began to feel like something else, like preparation. And yet, even as I gathered my quiet arsenal of evidence, I felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on me. I couldn't tell friends. I was too ashamed. Who admits that their own parents steal from them? Who wants to be the guy who says, "Yeah, my brother's Rolex? I paid for that." So I carried it alone, the bitterness curling tighter every day. The lowest point came one evening when I opened my fridge and found it nearly empty. Just a few eggs, some condiments, a bottle of water. I'd been so consumed with everything else that I hadn't even noticed how little I'd been eating. My own family was feasting on luxuries while I was skipping meals to keep my head above water. I sat on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and for the first time, I let myself cry. Not just from anger, but from grief. Grief for the family I thought I had. But tears only last so long. When they dried, I realized something important. I wasn't broken. I was bruised, beaten down, but not broken. And if they thought I was going to play my role forever, quietly handing over my life, while they smiled and took more, they were wrong. So I kept my head down. I kept working. I kept saving. And all the while, I added to that folder. Piece by piece, fact by fact. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I knew one day I'd need it. Because sooner or later, there would come a time to stop suffering and start acting. The weeks bled into months, and while the ache of betrayal still lingered like a bruise I couldn't hide, something inside me began to shift. I wasn't the same hollow version of myself who had sat on the kitchen floor staring at an empty fridge. I had hit rock bottom, and as strange as it sounds, there was a kind of freedom in that. When you've lost the illusion that family will protect you, you stop waiting for them to save you. You realize it's only you, and once I accepted that, I started to climb. The first step was financial. I tightened everything. No more casual transfers when mom called. No more helping out when Kyle was between jobs. I redirected that energy into myself. Every paycheck, I put money into savings accounts they couldn't touch. I paid off my debts faster. I researched investments late at night, teaching myself things I should have learned years ago but never bothered with because I was too busy cushioning everyone else's life. And the strangest thing happened. The more I focused on myself, the lighter I felt. I started sleeping again. I ate better. My mind, once fogged with guilt and frustration, began to clear. Work became easier too, without the constant drain of family drama. I had energy to pour into projects. My boss noticed. By the end of the quarter, I was promoted, with a raise that made my heart race when I saw the numbers. I didn't tell my family. I kept it to myself like a secret flame, something sacred that belonged only to me. Mom would still call occasionally, always starting with small talk before slipping in a request. "The car needs repairs," she'd sigh. "Kyle's been so stressed. We're trying to make things easier for him." I learned to deflect with calm firmness. "I can't help right now, Mom. I'm focused on some things of my own." At first, she pushed back, her tone sharp with disappointment. But when I didn't budge, something in her voice faltered. I could almost hear the cracks forming in her certainty that I would always cave. Meanwhile, Kyle's life remained the same carousel of indulgence. His social media was full of photos, trips, clothes, flashy dinners. But when I looked closer, I saw the hollowness in his captions. He wasn't talking about success as much anymore. The comments from friends grew more skeptical. Didn't you just quit your job? How do you even afford all this? For the first time, people outside our family were starting to see through him. That gave me a quiet satisfaction, but I didn't gloat. Not yet. I stayed silent, watching, waiting. I also began working on myself beyond money. I joined a gym, something I'd always put off because I was too tired or too busy. At first, it was awkward. Machines I didn't know how to use, routines that left me sore for days. But I stuck with it, and soon I noticed the changes. Not just in my body, but in how I carried myself. For years, I'd walked into my parents' house slouched, weighed down, apologetic. Now, I stood taller. When I caught my reflection, I almost didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked stronger, more sure of himself. And with strength came clarity. I started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted from. I realized how much I'd isolated myself, how ashamed I'd been to admit what was happening at home. One night, over drinks, I finally opened up to my oldest friend, Marcus. I told him everything. The Rolex, the stolen cards, the manipulation. He listened without judgment, his expression hardening as I spoke. "Adrian," he said quietly, "that's not family. That's theft. That's abuse." Hearing it framed so bluntly shook me. For years, I'd been tangled in their narrative, convinced I was overreacting. But Marcus's words snapped me back into reality. I also started saying yes to opportunities one would have turned down before. A colleague invited me to a networking event, and instead of making excuses, I went. That night, I met someone who would later offer me freelance work on the side, extra income that padded my savings even more. Another time, I volunteered to lead a project at work. It terrified me, but I nailed it, and the recognition that followed opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Every success built on the last. My folder at home, the one labeled family, kept growing too. I wasn't obsessed with it, but I didn't ignore it either. Every shady call from mom, every smug message from Kyle, every receipt or bank notice, it all went into the folder. A quiet reminder, not of who I was, but of who they were. And slowly, a picture began to form. A future where I didn't just survive their betrayal, but turned it back on them. Not in a reckless, angry way, but in a calculated one. If they saw me as the responsible one, then I would use that role to my advantage. Because responsible doesn't just mean dependable, it can also mean dangerous when underestimated. The true shift came the day I visited their house again after months of distance. I hadn't planned to, but Dad called, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Your mom made dinner. Why don't you come by?" I went, not out of longing, but curiosity. I walked in, and the change was immediate. Kyle still smirked, still flashed his Rolex, but I didn't feel the old sting anymore. Mom tried her usual guilt. "We don't see you enough, Adrian." But it slid off me like water. I wasn't the same person they thought they could mold. As we ate, Kyle leaned over and whispered, "Bet you missed us, huh?" His words were meant to sting, but they didn't. I just smiled and said, "You'll see." He frowned, confused, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. That night, as I drove home, I realized I wasn't just climbing out of rock bottom. I was rising. Quietly, steadily, with purpose. My life was no longer theirs to drain. It was mine to build. And soon enough, they'd realize what that really meant. The shift in power was subtle at first, but once it started, I couldn't unsee it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family's chaos. I was observing it, taking notes, figuratively and literally. And when you stop being their pawn, you start to notice how predictable the game really is. It began with the bank investigation. Months after I'd filed disputes for the fraudulent credit cards, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside were statements, detailed timelines, and confirmation that my claims were valid. The accounts were closed, the balances erased from my record. But what struck me most wasn't the clean slate. It was the paperwork itself. The signatures, the applications. They were sloppy. My father's handwriting stood out in places where it shouldn't have. My mother's phone number was listed as the secondary contact. Kyle's name even appeared as a reference. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd left a trail. I slipped the documents into my family folder, which by now had become a binder. Neatly tabbed, organized, airtight. Each page felt like another brick in the foundation of something bigger than myself. For years, they had relied on the idea that I wouldn't fight back, that I was too loyal, too ashamed, too responsible to expose them. But shame was giving way to clarity, and loyalty had already been burned to ashes. Meanwhile, work was soaring. My promotion had put me in a role where I handled budgets, contracts, sensitive negotiations. I learned how to read fine print like a second language, how to notice when numbers didn't line up. Those skills bled into my personal life. I started pulling my family's stories apart the same way I'd dissect a contract. When Mom claimed the electric bill was higher, I asked for the statement. She faltered. When Dad hinted about unexpected expenses, I pressed for details. He stammered. It was like shining a light on cockroaches. They scattered. The more I pressed, the more cracks appeared. One afternoon, while Mom was distracted in the kitchen, I glanced at the stack of unopened mail on their counter. Among the envelopes was one with Kyle's name on it, a credit card statement. My eyes skimmed the numbers. Thousands spent on restaurants, clothes, gadgets. Minimum payment overdue. I slid it back before anyone noticed, but the information seared into my brain. Kyle wasn't just living off their manipulation of me. He was drowning in debt of his own making. That was useful. I also noticed tension between my parents when Kyle wasn't around. Little comments slipped through, like Mom saying, "We can't keep covering for him forever," or Dad muttering, "If Adrian finds out the rest, we're finished." The rest. That phrase lodged in my mind. What else had they hidden? The answer came one evening when Dad stepped out to smoke and forgot his phone on the table. It buzzed with a notification, and before I could stop myself, I glanced at the screen. An email subject line glared up at me. Final notice, overdue balance. The sender was a law firm. My pulse quickened. They weren't just leaning on me out of greed. They were desperate. I didn't open the phone, but I memorized the firm's name. Later that night, in the privacy of my apartment, I looked it up. It was a collections firm that handled large debts, the kind you couldn't just brush aside with excuses. Suddenly, everything clicked. The Rolex, the shopping sprees, the endless excuses about tight money. My parents weren't funding Kyle's lifestyle just out of favoritism. They were hiding the fact that they were in serious financial trouble themselves. That knowledge settled over me like armor. They had always positioned themselves as the ones in control, doling out approval, guilt, and manipulation at will. But now I saw the truth. They were weak, vulnerable, and if I wanted to, I could press on those cracks until the whole facade shattered. Around this time, I also reconnected with an old college friend, Leah, who worked in real estate. We met for coffee, just catching up, but as we talked about her work, an idea sparked in the back of my mind. She mentioned that she'd been helping clients scoop up foreclosed properties, places that had been lost to debt. I listened carefully, asking questions, learning how public those records were, how easy it was to trace ownership. By the time we finished, I knew two things. One, Leah had access to resources I didn't. And two, if my parents were tangled in debt, their names might not stay off those records for long. The pieces were falling into place. My binder of evidence, their mounting debts, Kyle's crumbling image, and my own steady rise, financially and professionally, giving me tools I'd never had before. The last push came at a family dinner I reluctantly agreed to attend. Kyle showed up late, as usual, but this time he wasn't as smug. The Rolex was still on his wrist, but he fiddled with it nervously, his jaw tight. Halfway through the meal, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and for the first time in years, I saw something other than arrogance on his face. Fear. He shoved the phone back in his pocket quickly, pretending nothing was wrong. That was when I knew for certain. Their house of cards was wobbling, and I was in the perfect position to watch it fall. Or maybe, if I chose carefully, to give it the slightest push. On the drive home, I didn't feel hollow anymore. I didn't feel like the victim they thought I was destined to be. I felt focused. Because I finally understood, they had written me into their script as the responsible one, the provider, the quiet background character in the story of Kyle's golden boy life. But what they hadn't realized was that the responsible one also becomes the most dangerous when he stops playing his part. And I had stopped. Revenge didn't come in one dramatic explosion. It came in pieces, quiet and deliberate, the way you dismantle a tower one block at a time until the weight makes it topple. If there was one thing I'd learned from years of being the responsible one, it was patience. They were so used to me reacting emotionally, folding under guilt, or disappearing into silence. But this time, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The first move was simple. I cut the money pipeline completely. No transfers, no helping out, no covering bills with a reluctant sigh. When Mom called asking for a little help with groceries, I told her gently, "I can't right now. Things are tight." The irony nearly choked me, but she didn't hear it. She just grew sharp and clipped, her disappointment thick in her voice. I let her stew. When Dad hinted about unexpected expenses, I said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." "You always do." He muttered something under his breath, but didn't push. Kyle, of course, sent me a text dripping with arrogance. "Don't forget where your responsibilities lie." I didn't reply. Silence, I realized, was its own weapon. But I wasn't stopping at silence. I still had that binder, and I started using it like a chessboard. I filed official fraud complaints on the credit cards they'd opened in my name. That triggered investigations, letters, and eventually, consequences that didn't land on me this time, but on them. I didn't need to point fingers. The paper trail spoke for itself. One evening, Mom called in a panic. "Adrian, we need to talk. Some people are making accusations." I simply said, "Handle it. I can't be involved." Her gasp on the other end was like a crack in glass. Next, I quietly reached out to Leah, my friend in real estate. I gave her my parents' names, asked her to keep an eye out for any properties tied to them. Within weeks, she sent me an email. Their mortgage was on the brink. Missed payments. Notices piling up. They had painted themselves as secure, stable, always in control, but in reality, they were dangling by a thread. I didn't swoop in to save them. That was the old me. Instead, I waited. Because when the notice of foreclosure eventually hit, I wanted to be ready. Leah had explained how auctions worked, how properties could be snapped up if you knew where to look. The idea of my parents' house, the house where they'd humiliated me, stolen from me, laughed while Kyle flaunted his Rolex, landing in my hands was almost too poetic to believe. In the meantime, I tightened the noose around Kyle's perfect little image. I didn't out him publicly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I slipped subtle truths into the right conversations. When one of his friends, who I still knew from years ago, asked me casually how Kyle was affording his lifestyle, I shrugged and said, "Not sure." Last I heard, he was drowning in debt. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. Word spread. Social media is a cruel thing. Once whispers start, they snowball. Within a month, Kyle's posts were flooded with comments that weren't congratulatory anymore. "Didn't you borrow money from your parents? Isn't that your brother's card?" The smugness in his photos didn't land the same when everyone suspected the truth. The best part? I never had to lift a finger directly. His own arrogance, combined with the reality of his choices, did the work for me. The real turning point came when Mom invited me over under the guise of family dinner. Against my better judgment, I went. I walked in to find the atmosphere thick with tension. Dad looked weary, Mom looked desperate, and Kyle looked furious. The meal was quiet until Mom finally blurted, "Adrian, you need to help us. This has gone too far." I set my fork down, calm as ever. "What do you mean?" Kyle slammed his hand on the table. "Don't play dumb. People are talking. The bank's on our backs. You started this." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "I started this. I didn't open fraudulent accounts. I didn't use someone else's money to buy a Rolex. I didn't lie." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "We were just trying to keep things together. You don't understand how hard it's been." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "No, Mom. I understand perfectly. You wanted me to believe that family meant sacrifice. But what you really meant was that my sacrifice kept your lies afloat. That's over now." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, they weren't smirking, dismissing, or guilt-tripping. They looked cornered. I excused myself shortly after, leaving them to stew in the ruins of their control. That night, I added a new section to the binder. Dinner. I wrote down every word, every crack in their composure, every sign of collapse. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The house of cards was trembling. And when it finally fell, I wanted to be the one holding the ground beneath it. It didn't take long after that dinner for the fallout to arrive. The cracks I'd seen were widening fast, and this time I didn't rush to patch them. I let them split open, piece by piece, until the whole facade they'd built collapsed under its own weight. It started with Kyle. His friends, The ones who used to fawn over every Rolex post and caption about success stopped playing along. The whispers I'd let loose found their way to the right ears, and soon his comment section turned into a courtroom. People called him out for being jobless, for living off his parents, for flashing things he hadn't earned. One of his old gym buddies even tagged him in a post about unpaid debts. Kyle tried to fight it at first, posting angrier captions about haters, but the more he fought, the more obvious it became that the mask had slipped. The golden boy image shattered. Then came my parents. The bank wasn't patient anymore. The foreclosure notice arrived like a death sentence. Leah sent me the details, and when the house went up for auction, I was there. I didn't announce myself. I didn't need to. Quietly, calmly, I bid. And when the gavel came down, I owned the very house they had raised us in. The same house where they had dismissed me, stolen from me, and crowned Kyle their pride and joy. The day the papers were finalized, I drove past the place, just once. Mom was standing on the porch, arms crossed, her face pale. Dad sat slumped on the steps, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Kyle wasn't there, probably hiding from the humiliation, but I didn't need to see him. I rolled down my window, just enough, and gave them a polite nod. "Take care," I said, then drove on. The final act was quiet but devastating. With the fraud cases, the debts, and the foreclosure, they were blacklisted from credit. Calls from collections didn't stop. Their safety net was gone, and they had no one left to lean on. No one but themselves. And Kyle, without his parents to prop him up, without me to funnel money into his life, was forced into reality. His Rolex ended up in a pawn shop within weeks. Meanwhile, my own life only climbed higher. I bought myself a new place, not the family home, but somewhere fresh, mine alone. Work thrived. My health thrived. I surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. Months later, Mom called one last time. Her voice was small, broken. "Adrian," she whispered, "we lost everything. We don't know what to do." I sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of years of manipulation, betrayal, and guilt. Then I answered softly, "You always said family shares. Now you're finally sharing what you gave me." "Nothing." She cried. I didn't. When I hung up, I placed the phone on the table, opened the binder one last time, and slid in the final note, closure. Then I closed it for good. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the responsible one carrying their burden. I was free. And as I stood by the window of my own home, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I smiled. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or messy. Sometimes it's simply walking away, while the people who underestimated you finally drown in the consequences they created themselves. The last thought I had before turning out the light was simple. They had written my role for me, but I'd written the ending. And this time, it was mine.